In the embrace of a sprawling, untamed forest, where the earliest breaths of dawn carried a crisp, biting chill that slipped through the dense foliage and the morning mist draped the landscape like a delicate, translucent veil, a young woman named lytutien stirred to meet the day. Her name was as humble and soft as the rustle of leaves caught in a fleeting breeze or the gentle murmur of a stream weaving through smooth, moss-covered stones, a quiet echo of her unassuming presence in a world both vast and unforgiving. She dwelt in a modest, weathered hut perched on a gentle incline, its walls a patchwork of bamboo lashed together with vines and sealed with mud, its roof a sagging canopy of palm leaves faded to a muted brown by relentless sun and torrential rains. The structure tilted slightly, as if bowing to the rugged terrain that cradled it, a fragile outpost in a wilderness where ancient trees rose like silent sentinels, their gnarled branches knitting a canopy that filtered the sunlight into a mosaic of shifting, dappled patterns across the forest floor. Inside, Tieu's home was a portrait of stark simplicity, shaped by the harsh necessities of her existence rather than any choice of her own. A bamboo cot, its frame worn and creaking beneath even her slight weight, leaned against one wall, its surface polished smooth by countless restless nights. In a shadowed corner sat a rudimentary stove, 3 uneven stones encircling a patch of ash and charred wood, where a chipped clay pot rested, its once rounded sides now stained a deep, sooty black from years of flickering fires. A threadbare mat, patched with mismatched scraps of cloth she'd painstakingly sewn together by the dim glow of an oil lamp, served as a bed for her young son, Bin, spread each evening across the packed dirt floor that bore the faint imprints of her footsteps. A rough-hewn stool, its legs wobbly and scarred from age, stood beside a basket mended with strips of vine to hold its splintering form together. These were the sparse possessions that defined her world. The air inside carried the earthy tang of soil mingled with the faint, lingering smokiness of burnt wood, a constant reminder of the forest that enveloped her life, its presence seeping through the cracks in the walls like an ever-watchful companion. For Tieu and Bin, life was a fragile thread stretched taut between survival and surrender, a daily negotiation with scarcity that tested the limits of her endurance. Yet she carried this burden with a resilience that belied her delicate frame, a quiet strength that shone through the weariness etched into her features. To her, Bin's well-being was a beacon that pierced the gloom of their hardships, his cheeks flushed with a soft, rosy glow as he slept, his laughter a bright, fleeting note that cut through the stillness of their days. Each ache in her legs from long treks across the uneven trails, each strain in her shoulders from the heavy load she bore, faded into insignificance in the glow of his presence, a silent fuel that propelled her forward through a relentless cycle of days that offered little mercy and even less reprieve. The memory of the man she'd once loved, who had walked away without a backward glance, lingered like a wound that time dulled but never fully healed, its edges tender beneath the surface of her resolve. It had been a rainy dusk when he left, the forest cloaked in a gray haze that blurred the boundaries of earth and sky, raindrops drumming a mournful rhythm on the leaves overhead. She'd stood beneath a dripping tree, her thin clothes soaked through to her skin, watching his silhouette vanish down the muddy path that snaked away from their shared life. He'd offered no farewell, no flicker of regret in his shadowed eyes, leaving her with nothing but a belly 5 months swollen with their child and the echo of promises that dissolved into the storm's roar. Pregnant and abandoned, she'd clung to his discarded shirt, a faded remnant of the warmth they'd once shared, her tears lost in the downpour as she sank to her knees in the mud. The rain had pounded around her, a cold, relentless curtain, until her sobs gave way to a hollow silence. In that stillness, as the storm slowed to a drizzle, a fierce resolve took root within her. She wiped her face with trembling, mud-streaked hands, stood on legs that shook beneath her weight, and vowed to the wind that she would raise her child, alone. She would be his mother, his father, his shield against a world that had turned its back on her. From that day, whispers began to drift through the scattered forest hamlets, tales of a fragile girl whose strength rivaled the oldest oaks, a solitary figure carved by loss into something unyielding, a quiet force amid the wilds. Tieu's mornings unfurled long before the first light of dawn, when the forest lay wrapped in a velvet darkness, its silence broken only by the ceaseless hum of crickets, the occasional hoot of an owl, and the rustle of unseen creatures stirring in the underbrush. She rose in the frigid pre-dawn air, her bare feet brushing the damp, cool floor as she moved with a quiet, practiced grace to coax a fire to life in her makeshift stove. The flames sputtered into being from the brittle twigs and scraps of bark she'd gathered the previous day, their glow dancing across her face, casting warm shadows that illuminated her sharp, determined eyes and the tight line of her lips, a barrier against the tide of thoughts that swirled within her. Wisps of pale blue smoke curled upward, threading through the gaps in the sagging roof, mingling with the fresh scent of dew-soaked earth and the faint, acrid bite of charred wood, a scene at once humble and steeped in a poignant, unspoken melancholy. Bin slept soundly in a faded red sling, its fabric worn thin and patched with scraps she'd stitched on during sleepless nights. His small form nestled against her as she worked, his steady breaths a soft counterpoint to the crackle of the fire and the distant calls of waking birds. She spooned a meager portion of watery porridge from the chipped pot, a thin, flavorless mix of rice, scavenged from a market vendor's fleeting charity, and a handful of wild herbs she'd plucked from the forest's edge the previous afternoon under a sky heavy with clouds. She ate quickly, barely tasting the bland warmth that slid down her throat, just enough to quiet the gnawing protests of her stomach before turning to the task of preparing her day's load, a basket of papayas destined for the market, a 10-kilometer trek she'd memorized down to every twist and stone. As the sun's first rays pierced the dense canopy, spilling a golden glow across the distant mountain ridges that rose like jagged teeth against the horizon, Tieu set out on her journey. She tied Bin to her back with a worn cloth, its edges frayed and patched from years of strain, securing each knot with meticulous care to ensure his safety as he drowsed against her shoulder. Her hands gripped a bamboo basket, its sides mended with vines she'd woven into the gaps to hold its splintering form together, a fragile vessel for the fruits of her labor. The trail from her hut to the papaya plot was a gauntlet of mud and stone, slick with morning dew and crisscrossed with gnarled roots that twisted across the path like snares waiting to trip the unwary. The air was thick with the damp, green scent of moss and the faint, sweet rot of fallen leaves, a chorus of birdsong rising from the branches above as the forest stirred to life around her. She moved with a steady, almost graceful stride, her feet toughened by years of barefoot wandering across this unforgiving terrain, her eyes fixed on the small patch of land that stood as both her lifeline and her legacy. That plot was her creation, a testament to her endurance, born in the long solitary months she'd carried Bin within her. With a belly growing heavy and round, she'd cleared the land alone, her hands blistered and bleeding from wielding a dull borrowed hoe, her back aching as she bent to plant seeds she traded her last scraps of cloth to obtain. She'd worked through days of blistering heat and nights of biting frost, coaxing life from the stubborn soil with nothing but her will and a desperate hope for a future she could give her child. Each tree in that patch held a memory etched into its bark. One had sprouted when Bin's first kicks fluttered within her, a fragile whisper of hope that had brought tears to her eyes in the stillness of her solitude. Another had taken root the day she birthed him alone, her screams lost to the wind as she labored on the forest floor, cutting the cord with trembling hands and wrapping him in her own shirt to shield him from the cold. A third stood as a silent mocker of a night she'd held him. Close, tears falling silently onto his small hungry face as she had no milk to give, her body too starved to sustain them both. The papayas that hung from those branches were her labor's hard-won reward, their weight a measure of the sweat that had soaked into the earth, the calluses on her palms a ledger of her relentless struggle against a world that offered no quarter. At the plot, she climbed the trees with a quiet agility, her small deft hands wielding a sharpened knife she kept tucked into her waistband, slicing each papaya free with precision and stacking them carefully in her basket to avoid bruising their tender flesh. Sweat beaded on her brow, trickling down her neck to dampen her thin, sun-bleached shirt until it clung to her skin, but she pressed on, her focus narrowed to the rhythm of her task. The sun climbed higher, its heat pressing down like a heavy hand, turning the air thick and sticky as flies buzzed lazily around the sweet bounty she harvested. Every so often, she paused to check on Bin, who played with sticks and pebbles in the dappled shade of a tree, his soft babbling a melody that cut through the forest's hum of life, crickets chirping, leaves rustling, a distant stream gurgling over rocks. Her eyes softened with hope and boundless affection as she watched him, her lips curving into a faint, weary smile that betrayed the exhaustion she carried. "A few more," she'd whisper to herself, "and we'll have sandals for you to replace the ones that split last month, or a handful of sugar to sweeten your porridge." That simple hope burned quietly within her, dulling the burn in her muscles from hours of climbing, the gnawing ache in her stomach that had become a constant companion, a hunger so familiar she scarcely noticed it anymore. When Bin's small whimpers rose above the rustle of leaves, signaling his hunger, she'd stop her work, kneeling to build a small fire from the twigs and fallen branches she'd gathered earlier along the trail. She unpacked her battered pot, its surface scarred and blackened from years of use, and poured in a scant measure of rice and water from a bamboo flask slung over her shoulder, stirring it over the flickering flames with a splintered stick she'd whittled to serve as a spoon. Her movements were careful, deliberate, each stir an effort to preserve every precious grain, her eyes darting to the pot as if willing it to stretch further than its meager contents could allow. When the porridge was ready, a thin, watery gruel that barely filled the bowl, she cooled each spoonful with soft breaths, feeding Bin with a gentle patience that softened the hard lines of her face, watching him eat with quiet satisfaction as he smacked his lips and reached for more with tiny, eager hands. She'd pat his back, humming a lullaby her mother had sung to her long ago in a village now lost to memory. "Sleep, little one, the wind carries the greens away, leaving the roots to endure the earth's trials. the melody soothed them both, a fragile thread of comfort against the loneliness that shadowed her nights when she'd sit by the dim glow of a flickering lamp, watching him sleep, her mind racing with worries about how long their dwindling stores of rice would last, how she'd shield him from the cold when the rains returned. Her past was a quiet ache that lingered in the corners of her mind, a tapestry of loss and survival woven through her 23 years. She'd been raised by a mother who scraped by gathering medicinal herbs and weaving baskets in a small village on the forest's edge, a woman whose hands were rough but whose voice was soft with stories of better days. When illness claimed her mother at 13, Tieu had been left to fend for herself, a child scavenging roots and berries, trading what she could for scraps of food or cloth, learning the forest's secrets through trial and error. She'd grown up fast, her youth swallowed by necessity, until she met Bin's father, a wandering trader with a quick smile and warm words that promised her a life beyond the margins. She believed him, followed him deeper into the forest with dreams of a family, a home, only to be left with nothing but his child and her own grit when he grew restless and slipped away, chasing horizons she couldn't follow. That betrayal had hardened her, stripping away the last vestiges of naivety, forging a woman who stood alone but unbroken, her strength rooted in the refusal to let despair claim her. One day, as she walked the winding trail to the market, a narrow ribbon of earth flanked by towering ferns and overhanging branches heavy with dew, the sun climbed high, casting flickering patches of light through the leaves that danced on the ground like scattered embers. Tieu stopped short, her breath catching in her throat, her feet seeming to root themselves to the earth as her gaze fell upon a sight that seized her heart with an iron grip. Beside the path, half hidden in a tangle of wild grass that swayed gently in the breeze, lay a tattered cardboard box, its edges softened by dampness and wear. Within it was a baby girl, no more than a few months old, huddled in a thin, ragged scrap of cloth that offered no warmth, her small face streaked with dried tears that had carved faint trails through the dirt smudging her cheeks. The infant shivered in fits, her body racked by cold and hunger, her wide, round eyes darting about in bewildered fear, as if pleading silently for rescue from the vast, indifferent wilderness that loomed around her. Beside her lay a crumpled note, its jagged script scrawled in desperation, the ink blurred as if written through a flood of tears. "Please, whoever finds my child, take her and raise her. I have no other way." Tieu sank to her knees beside the box, her trembling hands lifting the note to read, the words swimming before her eyes as tears welled up and spilled over. Her heart splintered with a mother's empathy, a visceral understanding that cut deeper than any blade. She knew that despair had felt its cold fingers brush her soul in the days when Bin was still unborn, moments when hunger and exhaustion had nearly broken her, when she'd stood on the edge of giving up, only to be pulled back by the fierce, unyielding love that anchored her to him. She remembered the nights she'd lain awake, listening to his soft breathing in her womb, wondering if she could bring him into a world so harsh, and the mornings she'd risen with nothing but resolve to carry on. She bent forward, lifting the child into her arms, feeling the faint, fragile warmth of her small body against her chest, a life so light it seemed she might slip away like a wisp of smoke. "Who could leave you, little one?" she whispered, her voice cracking with emotion. "You're cold, aren't you? Hungry? Don't be afraid, I'm here now." But reality struck hard, a cold, unyielding wave that crashed over her fleeting tenderness. Bin slept soundly on her back, his familiar weight a steady rhythm against her spine. This tiny girl trembled in her arms, a new and uncertain burden. Her life was a threadbare cloth, stretched thin by the needs of one child. Could it possibly hold another? Her mind raced with the weight of it, the empty pots that greeted her too often at day's end, the fevers that had racked Bin's small body with no money for medicine, the time she'd collapsed in the field from hunger, waking hours later to a sky indifferent to her plight. She thought of the lean seasons when she'd survived on bitter roots and stream water, the night she'd gone to bed with an empty stomach so Bin could have the last spoonful of porridge, the morning she'd woken to his cries with nothing to offer but her arms and a whispered promise that she'd find a way. Another child, how could she bear it? The question gnawed at her, tearing her heart between the boundless compassion that surged within her and the dread of a future stretched beyond her breaking point. Yet as she gazed into the baby's pure, desperate eyes that held no judgment, only a silent, piercing plea, something within her shifted. She couldn't turn away, couldn't leave this fragile soul to the mercy of the forest's cold embrace, to a fate she'd fought so hard to spare Bin. With shaking hands, she wrapped the infant in her own tattered shawl, its fabric thin and patched but warm from her body, and tied her securely to her chest beside Bin, who stirred faintly at the added presence. "I have so little," she murmured, her voice thick with unshed tears, "so little to give, but I'll try. Tearful for you." She named the girl Hoa, a wildflower, small yet defiant amid the wild's harshness, a mirror of her own spirit, a symbol of life persisting against all odds. The walk to the market grew grueling, each step a test of her waning strength. Her slender shoulders sagged under the weight of 2 children, her frame bowing slightly as exhaustion seeped into her bones. Her feet, bare after her sandals had split days before, bled from the stony path, each sharp rock and thorn a fresh sting she endured with a clenched jaw. The forest wind whipped around her, cold and biting, tugging at her hair and chilling her sweat-dampened skin, but she pressed on, her voice a soft thread of reassurance as she spoke to her children to keep despair at bay. "We'll make it, my little ones," she said, her words a lifeline she clung to. "We'll sell the fruit, and I'll find something for us. I promise." At the market, she laid out her papayas in her usual corner, a cramped space amid the clamor of vendors and buyers, the air thick with the mingled scents of overripe fruit, dried fish, and dust kicked up by passing feet. She stood there, bin on her back and hoa against her chest, her eyes a mix of grit and fatigue, her thin frame swaying slightly from the effort of the journey. The coins she earned, crumpled, meager things haggled from tight-fisted traders who eyed her worn appearance with thinly veiled pity, barely stretched to buy more rice and a handful of wilted greens, their leaves bruised and yellowing from days in the sun. Her hands trembled as she counted them, each one a fragile hope too small to hold the weight of her needs. Seeking a path forward, she wove through the market's dusty lanes to the home of Mrs. Tam, a village elder known far and wide for her boundless kindness, a woman whose weathered hands and warm hearth had sheltered many a lost soul. Mrs. Tam lived alone in a sturdy wooden house on the village's edge, its walls stained with age and its roof patched with tin, a childless widow who filled her days knitting blankets and cooking extra rice for those in need. She'd taken in strays before, orphan children, weary travelers, and raised them with a quiet, steady love that belied her years. Tieu poured out Hoa's story, her voice halting as she recounted finding the child abandoned on the trail, the note's desperate plea still echoing in her mind. Mrs. Tam listened, her eyes glistening, then took the baby into her arms, tears tracing paths down her lined face as she cradled her gently. "Poor little soul," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Her mother must have been broken to leave her like this. Leave her with me, Tieu. I'll raise her as my own, give her the home you can't." Tieu's heart clenched, a sharp pang of loss slicing through her, but she knew this was Hoa's best chance, a life with a woman whose hearth was warm, whose larder held more than hers ever could. She pressed a lingering kiss to Hoa's forehead, breathing in the faint, sweet scent of her skin, and whispered, "Live well, little Hoa. You're safe now. Grow strong." The journey home stretched long into the dusk, Ben dozing on her back, his small hands clutching her shoulders as the sun dipped low, painting the sky with streaks of orange and purple that bled into the treetops. Her soul felt heavy yet strangely light, a tangle of sorrow and solace weaving through her as she walked. She'd lost so much: love, security, the ease of youth, but not her capacity to care, a flame that burned steady even when her strength faltered. Her figure faded into the trees, a small, fierce bloom persisting in the wilderness, her steps slow but sure. The forest wind carried the faint echo of her lullaby, a testament to her resolve. She'd rise again tomorrow, her hand steady, her heart firm, having planted a seed of love that would grow beyond her reach. Days later, whispers of her deed rippled through the hamlets, how a lone mother with nothing but a basket of fruit and a will of iron had carried a stranger's child to safety. Some shook their heads, calling her reckless, others hailed her a quiet savior. She paid no mind, her days folding into the familiar rhythm of survival, gathering wood, tending the plot, cradling Ben as night fell. And though she walked alone, she carried the weight of those she'd touched, a strength forged not in plenty, but in the tender, unbreakable will to give when she had nothing left to offer.
Câu chuyện hành trình nhân duyên. Sáng sớm, mặt trời vừa hé rạng sau dãy núi xa, lythieuca vội vã chuẩn bị dụng cụ để ra vườn thu hoạch đu đủ. Những trái đu đủ chín vàng lấp ló sau tán lá xanh mướt, báo hiệu một ngày làm việc bận rộn nhưng đầy hy vọng. Cô nâng niu từng trái một, nhẹ nhàng hái xuống và xếp gọn vào giỏ, chuẩn bị mang ra chợ bán để kiếm chút tiền trang trải cuộc sống. Trên đường về, ngang qua một con đường vắng bên bìa rừng, tiểu ca bỗng nghe thấy tiếng khóc yếu ớt. Cô dừng lại, nhìn quanh quất giữa những bụi cỏ dại, và tim cô như thắt lại khi phát hiện một bé gái sơ sinh bị bỏ rơi, quấn trong một chiếc chăn mỏng, gương mặt nhỏ xíu đỏ ửng vì lạnh và đói. Không chần chừ, tiểu ca vội bế đứa bé lên, cảm nhận hơi ấm bé nhỏ run rẩy trong vòng tay mình. Cô nhìn quanh, cố gắng tìm kiếm dấu vết của người mẹ nhưng vô vọng. Không biết ai đã để lại đứa trẻ ở đây, nhưng điều quan trọng nhất lúc này là làm sao giúp em sống sót. Mang theo đứa bé, Tiểu Ca vội vã đến làng tìm kiếm người giúp đỡ. Cả làng xôn xao khi biết chuyện. Ai cũng thương cảm nhưng chẳng ai đủ điều kiện để nhận nuôi đứa bé.